My father didn't just have a favorite. He handed my stepbrother the keys to the kingdom while leaving me with nothing but a cold shoulder. He thought I was defeated, but he underestimated how much I learned while watching from the shadows. Now, I own every single drop of his oil empire. The day my father handed Dominic the keys to Ashford Energy, it was raining in Houston. Not the soft, apologetic kind of rain that whispers against window panes and makes you feel contemplative. This was Houston rain, aggressive, almost biblical, the kind that flattens your suit jacket against your back within 30 seconds and makes the air smell like hot asphalt and something burning underneath. I remember standing in the lobby of the Ashford Tower, watching sheets of water slide down the 60-story glass facade, thinking that even the weather understood what was about to happen inside that building was wrong. I was 31 years old. I had spent the previous 8 years working inside Ashford Energy, genuinely working, not in the decorative way that sons of billionaires sometimes work, where they're assigned a corner office and a title that means nothing and an assistant who does everything while they attend client dinners and call it strategy. I mean working in the actual sense. I started in the geological survey division when I was 23, reading seismic data and core samples in a trailer outside Midland, Texas, while my colleagues, older men who had done this their whole lives, tested me constantly, looking for the soft center they assumed every rich kid had. I didn't have one. Or, if I did, I hit well enough that after 6 months, the senior geologist, a weatherman named Carl Briggs, who had worked for my father since before I was born, told me I had a better eye for subsurface structure than any junior analyst he'd trained in 20 years. I worked my way through 3 divisions in 8 years. Geology, then operations, then corporate strategy, where I spent 2 years restructuring how Ashford Energy approached offshore lease acquisitions, work that, by conservative internal estimates, generated over $400 million in additional revenue over a 5-year projection window. I did all of it without my last name being mentioned in any of the presentations. I insisted on it. I wanted whatever I built be evaluated on its own merit, not dismissed or inflated because of whose blood ran through me. My father knew about every piece of it. He received the reports. He attended the board meetings where my analyses were presented. He nodded at the numbers. He never once said my name out loud in those rooms. Dominic Ashford. Technically Dominic Reeves until my father legally adopted him 12 years ago after marrying his mother, Patricia, which made Dominic 25 at the time of adoption. A detail that always struck me as more symbolic than parental. Had spent the same 8 years doing something else entirely. He had an office on the 43rd floor with a view that cost more per square foot than most people's homes. He attended conferences. He gave interviews to energy trade publications where he spoke with great authority about the future of sustainable petroleum extraction, using phrases he had clearly rehearsed because when journalists asked follow-up questions that required him to go one level deeper, his answers became circular, like a man walking confidently in a direction he could not actually define. He played golf with legislators. He cultivated what my father called relationships, which was a word my father used for any activity that happened at a dinner table rather than a desk. Dominic was charming. I want to be fair about that because this story loses something if I paint him as simply villainous. He had the specific, dangerous charm of someone who has never been truly held accountable for anything, which meant his confidence was completely untethered from his competence, and that combination, absolute confidence with zero accountability, can be extraordinarily persuasive to people who confuse certainty with capability. My father was one of those people. My father had built Ashford Energy from a single lease operation in 1987 into a multi-continental energy corporation worth, at its peak, somewhere north of $8 billion. And he had done it through a combination of genuine brilliance and a particular kind of stubbornness that most people would call vision when it works and recklessness when it doesn't. He was not a man who questioned his instincts. And his instinct, from the moment Dominic walked into his life wearing a borrowed suit and calling him sir with that disarming, slightly self-deprecating smile, was that Dominic was the one. I never fully understood it. I have had years now to turn it over, and I still cannot reach the bottom of it. My mother, Eleanor, died when I was 9. A car accident on a stretch of highway outside of Galveston that my father never talked about directly, but that I could feel shaped everything about how he moved through the world afterward. He became harder after that. Not cruel, but sealed. like something inside him had been locked away, and he had thrown the key somewhere deep enough that he stopped looking for it. When Patricia came along 8 years later, she brought with her a warmth and an ease that I think my father had genuinely forgotten was possible, and Dominic came packaged with that warmth, a living extension of everything Patricia represented. I think my father looked at Dominic and saw a fresh beginning, and I think he looked at me and saw the weight of everything that had come before. That is not an excuse. I want to be clear about that. Understanding a wound does not make it stop bleeding. The ceremony, and it truly was a ceremony, orchestrated with the kind of deliberate theater that my father usually reserved for major acquisition announcements, took place in the Ashford Tower boardroom on the 14th of March. 63 people were present. Board members, senior executives, a handful of carefully selected journalists from the energy press, and family, which in practical terms meant Patricia, radiant in a pale blue dress, and me, standing near the back of the room in a position I had not been assigned but had chosen because it was close to the door. My father stood at the head of the long mahogany table and spoke for approximately 20 minutes. He talked about legacy. He talked about vision. He talked about the future of Ashford Energy in the global energy transition landscape, and I noticed he used several phrases from a presentation I had written 18 months earlier, which I chose to find darkly funny rather than enraging because the alternative was to flip the mahogany table, and the table was bolted to the floor. He talked about the qualities of leadership, decisiveness, presence, the ability to inspire loyalty, and as he enumerated these qualities, every person in the room understood instinctively that he was describing the man standing to his left, not the man standing near the back door. Then he said Dominic's name, and the room applauded, and Dominic walked forward with that practiced, slightly humble smile and shook my father's hand, and my father who had not hugged me since I was approximately 12 years old, pulled Dominic into a full embrace, one hand gripping the back of his neck the way fathers do with sons they are genuinely proud of, and held him there for a long moment while the cameras clicked. I watched this from the back of the room. I kept my face completely neutral. I had been practicing that particular expression for years, and by this point I had refined it into something that could pass for quiet professionalism in any lighting condition. Nobody looked at me. There was no reason to. The story in that room had a protagonist, and it was not me, and everyone present understood that implicitly, the way audiences understand who the camera is following. I left before the champagne was poured. I walked out into the Houston rain, and I stood on the sidewalk outside Ashford Tower for a moment, letting the water ruin my jacket, and I thought with great clarity about two things simultaneously. The first was that I was done, not done in the broken, defeated sense, but done in a way that a decision finally made after years of deliberation produces a specific kind of quiet. I was done waiting for my father to see me, done calculating how to present my work in ways that might finally register, done existing inside a structure that had been designed, whether consciously or not, to overlook me. The second thing I thought was this: he has just made the most expensive mistake of his life, and he doesn't know it yet. I hailed a cab. I had a meeting to get to. The meeting was in a coffee shop 12 blocks from Ashford Tower, unremarkable in every way, which was precisely why I had chosen it. The man sitting across from me when I arrived, damp and deliberate, was named Marcus Webb. Marcus was 44, a former securities attorney turned private equity specialist, and he had been introduced to me 2 years earlier by a mutual contact in the offshore investment community. Introduced in a casual, almost accidental way that the most important introductions always seem to happen at the tail end of a conference cocktail hour when most people were already thinking about dinner. We had talked for 40 minutes that night about subsurface geology and capital structure and the specific inefficiencies that emerge in family-owned energy companies during succession events. And by the end of those 40 minutes, I had understood that Marcus Webb was exactly the kind of person I was going to need. I sat down across from him. He looked at my wet jacket and said nothing about it, which I appreciated. "It happened," I said. "I assumed," he said. "I saw the press release." We ordered coffee, and then, over the next 2 hours, in a booth in an unremarkable coffee shop 12 blocks from the building that should have been mine, we began to build the architecture of what would eventually become the most methodical corporate acquisition in the history of the Houston energy sector. At least, that is what one financial journalist would call it 3 years later. At the time, Sitting in that booth with rain still dry in the fibers of my jacket and my father's embrace of another man still fresh in my peripheral vision, it felt less like architecture and more like breathing, like the first full breath after a very long time of breathing shallowly. The entity we were constructing had been in preliminary planning for 14 months. I want to make that clear because I think it matters to the character of what this story is actually about. This was not a revenge fantasy that crystallized the moment my father chose Dominic. This was a plan that had been forming quietly, rationally, with the same methodical discipline I had brought to every geological survey and every operational restructuring I had ever done inside Ashford Energy. The ceremony that morning was not the beginning. It was simply the moment the door closed completely. And a closed door, I have always found, focuses the mind wonderfully. The entity was registered in Delaware as Meridian Capital Partners, LLC, Delaware for the privacy protections, the favorable corporate statutes, and the simple fact that thousands of holding companies are registered there and the name generates no particular attention. The structure was layered. Meridian sat above two subsidiary vehicles, one domiciled in the Cayman Islands and one in Luxembourg, and those subsidiaries were connected through a series of contractual arrangements to three separate investment funds that Marcus managed through his firm. To anyone examining the corporate registry, Meridian Capital Partners looked like what it was designed to look like, a mid-sized private equity vehicle with interests in energy infrastructure, which was true. It simply was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that every dollar flowing through that structure ultimately traced back to me. $18 million of my own capital, accumulated over 8 years through salary, bonuses, and several early-stage energy investments I had made quietly using knowledge I had developed through my actual work, seeded the initial fund. Another $40 million came from three outside investors whose identities were protected by the fund structure and whose involvement I had secured over the preceding year through conversations that were always framed as general investment opportunities and never, not once, connected to Ashford Energy or to my last name. I had been Ethan Cross in those conversations. Cross was my mother's maiden name. It was the first time I had used it, and using it felt, in some way I cannot fully explain, like wearing something that had always belonged to me. Marcus took a long sip of his coffee and set the cup down carefully. Now that it confirmed, he said, "The timeline accelerates." "Yes," I said. "He'll make changes quickly. New CEO Energy. Want to put a stamp on things. That means disruption at the senior level, which means opportunity." I nodded. I had anticipated this. Dominic's first instinct in any position of new authority was to surround himself with people who made him feel comfortable, which meant people who reflected his confidence back at him, rather than people who might complicate his decisions with knowledge. Within the first 6 months of his tenure as CEO, I predicted Ashford Energy would lose between 4 and 7 senior executives who represented the actual operational intelligence of the company. Those departures would create gaps. Gaps created vulnerability. Vulnerability, properly understood and carefully approached, was simply another word for entry point. "There's something else," Marcus said. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, 2 pages, which he slid across the table. The Larson Block. I unfolded it. The Larson Block was a set of offshore lease positions in the Gulf of Mexico that Ashford Energy had been carrying on its books for 11 years as speculative assets. Parcels of seafloor where the geological surveys had been inconclusive enough to justify neither development nor divestiture, so they had simply sat there, periodically revalued, generating carrying costs and no revenue. I had studied those lease positions extensively during my time in the geology division. I had run my own secondary analysis on the seismic data using a modeling approach that had not been available when the original surveys were conducted, and my conclusion, which I had written into a report that I never submitted because I understood even then that the information was more valuable held privately than shared institutionally, was that the Larson Block almost certainly sat above a formation that, properly developed, would produce somewhere between 80 and 120 million barrels of recoverable crude over a 20-year extraction window. The document Marcus had slid across the table was a preliminary valuation prepared by an independent petroleum engineering firm, commissioned under Meridian's name, that had reached a similar conclusion using updated modeling. The number at the bottom of the second page was not quite what my own analysis had suggested, but it was close enough to confirm that I had not been wrong. He'll want to clean up the balance sheet, I said, looking at the document. The legacy assets with no near-term revenue profile are exactly the kind of thing Dominic will want gone. Makes the books look cleaner. Makes him look decisive. That's my read as well, Marcus said. I refolded the document and put it in my jacket pocket, outside the window. The rain had not stopped. Then we wait, I said, and we watch. Waiting, it turns out, is an extraordinarily active process when you're doing it correctly. Over the following 8 months, while Dominic settled into the CEO's office on the 58th floor of Ashford Tower and began redecorating and reorganizing in the ways I had predicted, 5 senior departures in the first 4 months, which was slightly faster than my estimate. I was building Meridian into something real, not just a holding structure, but an operational entity with genuine credibility in the market, because the acquisition I was planning required that Meridian be perceived as a serious, independent buyer, and serious independent buyers have track records. We made 3 small acquisitions in that period. A pipeline service company in Oklahoma that was undervalued and modestly profitable. A minority stake in a West Texas drilling operation run by a former Ashford Energy field manager named Torres, who had left the company during the first wave of Dominic's reorganization, and who brought with him not only genuine technical competence, but also a first-hand view of what was happening inside Ashford's operational structure, and a consulting contract with a Houston-based reservoir engineering firm that, among other things, maintained ongoing relationships with several members of Ashford Energy's geological team. None of these moves were accidental. Each one was a thread, and I was weaving something. I had learned to think this way during those years in the Geological Survey Division, studying subsurface formations from seismic data, the practice of looking at what you cannot see directly and inferring its shape from the patterns of what you can. You develop patience that way. You develop the ability to hold a great deal of information in suspension and wait for the picture to resolve. Most people are not willing to sit with that much unresolved information for that long. They need the picture sooner. That need for premature resolution is, in the corporate world as much as a geological one, the source of most expensive mistakes. Dominic made his first expensive mistake in month 7. It was not a dramatic mistake. It did not appear in the press. It was a quiet, internal decision to reclassify a set of legacy asset positions, including the Larson block, as held for sale, which was an accounting designation that triggered a formal divestiture process. The decision was driven by a consulting firm Dominic had brought in during his first month, a group of generalist strategy consultants who were very good at producing slide decks and very limited in their actual understanding of upstream petroleum asset valuation. They had looked at the Larson block and seen carrying costs with no near-term revenue. They had not looked at the seismic data. Marcus called me the morning the internal reclassification memo circulated. He had a source inside Ashford's finance division, not a planted source, simply a former colleague who had moved to Ashford 2 years prior and occasionally shared general market intelligence in the way that professionals in a specialized industry sometimes do. "It's moving," Marcus said. "Timeline?" I said, 6 to 8 weeks to formal offer solicitation. I was standing in the office I had leased from Meridian in a building in the Galleria area. Deliberate distance from downtown, deliberate distance from Ashford Tower, looking out at the Houston skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. I could see the Ashford Tower from where I stood if I looked slightly left. I generally did not look slightly left. "Make sure we're positioned to receive the solicitation," I said. "Already done," Marcus said. The formal offer solicitation came in week 7. Meridian Capital Partners received it along with, according to our later intelligence, 11 other potential buyers. The Larson block was being packaged with 3 other legacy offshore positions into a single divestiture bundle, which is a kind of move that made sense from an administrative efficiency standpoint and made it slightly more complex to value accurately, because the other 3 positions genuinely were marginal. The bundle pricing would reflect a blended view that, for most buyers, would discount the total package toward the marginal value of the weaker assets, unless a buyer had specific intelligence about the true value of the Larson component, which only one buyer in that process did. We moved carefully. The bid we submitted was above market for the bundle. High enough to win, not so high as to signal that we knew something the seller didn't, because a bid that dramatically overpays for an ostensibly marginal asset attracts exactly the kind of scrutiny I needed to avoid at this stage. Marcus had modeled the bid range extensively, and we landed at a number that read as an aggressive but defensible offer from a buyer with a strategic rationale for the Gulf positions. The strategic rationale we articulated in our bid documentation: consolidation with our existing Oklahoma pipeline infrastructure, long-term held-for-development posture on the offshore parcels, was genuine enough to withstand examination. The bid was accepted in week 9. Meridian Capital Partners acquired the Larson Block and its companion assets for $61 million. The transaction closed quietly, covering the trade press as a routine divestiture with a brief mention in Ashford Energy's next quarterly filing under Strategic Portfolio Optimization. My father, I later learned, approved the sale in a board meeting that lasted approximately 40 minutes. I drove past the Ashford Tower the evening the closing wire cleared. I did not stop. I did not feel the particular swelling satisfaction that movies have taught us to expect from moments of vindication. What I felt was something more clinical and more sustaining than satisfaction. The confirmation that I had been right about the asset, about my approach, about the patience required to play a longer game than the one everyone else was playing. I drove home and made dinner and went to sleep at a reasonable hour. There was more work to do. The months that followed were the months in which Dominic Asher began, with increasing velocity and decreasing awareness, to demonstrate exactly why handing him the keys to an $8 billion energy corporation had been the most consequential error of judgment my father had made in a 40-year business career. The consulting firm's restructuring recommendations, implemented wholesale, had eliminated not just redundant costs but embedded institutional knowledge, the kind that does not appear on an organizational chart but that hold the actual operational logic of a company together. The senior departures I had predicted had taken with them relationships, technical expertise, and in 2 cases, key contacts in the regulatory environment that governed Ashford's offshore operations. By month 14 of Dominic's tenure, Ashford Energy had missed 2 consecutive quarterly earnings projections. The miss was not catastrophic. The company was too large and too established for a 14-month stumble to constitute an existential threat. But in an industry where credibility is currency, the signal it sent to the institutional investor community was specific and damaging. Analysts began revising their price targets. 2 significant institutional shareholders reduced their positions. The board, which had been uniformly supportive of Dominic's appointment in the first flush of succession, began having conversations in smaller, quieter configurations. I knew about several of those conversations. One of the board members, a woman named Diane Okafor, who had served on the Ashford board for 9 years and who had built her career in operational finance rather than relationship management, had been a quiet admirer of the work I had done in the corporate strategy division. She had asked about me twice in board meetings after my departure from the company. I knew this from Carl Briggs, who had remained at Ashford and who spoke to me periodically in the careful, indirect way of someone who understood the sensitivity of what he was doing. Diane had not reached out to me directly. She was far too careful for that. But she knew Meridian's name by now. We had established enough of a profile in the market that a board member of Ashford Energy doing her fiduciary due diligence would be aware of us. And the fact that she had not raised any questions about Meridian's acquisition of the Larson bundle told me she understood the situation more completely than she had let on. I let that understanding sit. I did not approach Diane Okafor. Not yet. Timing in any acquisition is everything, and the timing here was not yet right. What I did instead, in month 16, was begin the second phase of what Marcus and I had taken to calling, in the privacy of our planning sessions, the long position. The Larson Block's development potential was by now confirmed. We had run additional surveys using Meridian's own geological team, and the formation was every bit as productive as my original analysis had suggested. Development would require capital, and we had structured Meridian specifically to be able to raise that capital. But the more interesting question was what the confirmed value of the Larson Block did to strategic calculus around Ashford Energy's remaining offshore portfolio. Because the Larson formation did not stop at the boundary of the leases we had acquired. It extended, according to our updated modeling, beneath several adjacent lease positions that were still held by Ashford Energy. positions that were currently being carried on Ashford's books at nominal value, because Ashford's internal geological team, depleted by Dominic's reorganization, had not run the kind of updated modeling that would reveal the formation's true extent, which meant Ashford Energy was sitting on assets of substantial undiscovered value, while simultaneously underperforming operationally and losing the confidence of its institutional shareholder base. That combination, undervalued assets, operational drift, weakening investor confidence, a leadership team that was increasingly unable to defend its strategic decisions to a board growing quietly restive, created conditions that every acquisition specialist learns to recognize the way a geologist learns to read rock formations. It is a specific texture, and once you learn to see it, it becomes unmistakable. I scheduled a call with Marcus on a Tuesday morning in November, standing at the window of the Meridian office with coffee that had gone cold while I was reading the latest analysis from our reservoir engineering firm. "It's time to move to phase 2, I said. "Agreed," Marcus said, "but I need to ask you something first." "Go ahead." There was a brief pause. Marcus was not a man who paused before saying things casually. "How do you want to handle the personal dimension of this? Because phase 2 makes it visible. At some point, your name is going to surface. There's no structure elegant enough to prevent that indefinitely once we're moving at the scale we're talking about. And when it surfaces, the story becomes something specific. It becomes the story you already know it is." I looked at the skyline, at the building slightly left of center. "I know," I said. "Does that change anything for you?" I thought about my father in that boardroom, one hand gripping the back of Dominic's neck. I thought about a car accident on a highway outside Galveston, and a man who sealed himself afterward and looked at a surviving child and saw only the weight of what had been lost. I thought about 8 years of work that was received and processed and never acknowledged by name. I thought about a coffee shop in the rain and a decision that felt like breathing. "No," I said, "it doesn't change anything. Make the calls." Phase 2 began the following week. It was more complex, more expensive, and more exposed than phase 1, and every bit was built on the foundation of what had come before: the confirmed asset value, the established credibility, the quiet relationships, the patience. Marcus approached 3 of the institutional shareholders who had reduced their Ashford positions, not as a buyer but as a fellow investor with a perspective on the company's underlying asset value versus its current market performance. Those conversations were careful and entirely legal, conducted within the boundaries of what is permissible when you are not yet a material shareholder. The purpose was not to move markets. The purpose was to understand how the institutional community was thinking and to place Meridian's name and perspective in the minds of people who would soon be making important decisions. Carl Briggs called me on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks into phase 2. He was 70 now, and he called from what I knew was a landline in his home office, the way men of his generation still sometimes do for conversations they want to feel certain are private. "Your father heard something," Carl said. I waited. Someone mentioned Meridian in a board context. He doesn't know yet, but he's asking. What is he asking specifically? He's asking who owns it. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Tell him nothing, Carl. You don't know anything." "I don't," Carl said, which was technically true, in the way that things could be technically true without being fully honest. And Carl Briggs was old enough and had worked in the oil business long enough to understand that distinction precisely. My father found out on a Friday. I know this because Marcus called me at 8 in the evening, which was unusual, and when I answered, he said, "He knows it's you?" One of the institutional contacts confirmed Meridian's identity to an Ashford board member. "It'll be in front of your father by end of day if it hasn't already." I was sitting in my apartment. I had been reading. I put the book down on the cushion beside me. How did the board member respond? Apparently with more curiosity than alarm, Marcus said, which is interesting. "Diane," I said, "almost certainly." My phone rang 20 minutes later. It was a number I recognized immediately, in the way you recognize the phone numbers of people who shaped your earliest understanding of what it meant to be seen or not seen. I looked at it for 2 full rings. Then I answered, "Ethan." My father's voice was unchanged. That was the first thing I registered. How completely unchanged it was. Still the same measured baritone. still the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that speaking slowly made people lean toward him. "We need to talk." "Yes," I said. "We do." There was a pause. I heard him exhale a long, controlled breath that I recognized as a sound he made when he was recalibrating. "You've built something," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." Another pause. "How long?" "The planning started about 2 years before the ceremony," I said. "The legal entity was established 14 months before." The silence that followed was a different quality of silence. This one had weight. I had lived inside my father's silences for most of my life, and I had learned to read them the way I read seismic data, by the quality of the gap, by what the absence of sound was actually communicating underneath. This silence communicated something I had not heard from him before. It was not quite recognition. It was closer to the sound a man makes when he finally understands the shape of something he's been standing inside of without knowing. "Ethan," he said again, and then he stopped. I did not fill the silence for him. I had done that for 31 years. I was done doing it. "What do you want?" he said finally. I had thought carefully about how to answer this question, because I had known it was coming, and I knew it was the most important question in conversation. The wrong answer. The emotionally satisfying answer. The answer that enumerated every specific wound and demanded its precise compensation. Would make this a story about damage. And I was not interested in a story about damage. I was interested in a story about value. About the specific, demonstrable, market-confirmed value of what I had spent 8 years building inside his company and another 2 years building outside of it. "A meeting," I said, formal, with the full board, where I present Meridian's position and its proposals. Another pause. "And if I refuse?" "Then I continue doing exactly what I'm doing," I said, "without your input." He refused. Initially, I had anticipated this too. The refusal lasted 11 days, during which the market continued doing what markets do regardless of what any individual participant wants. And what the market was doing to Ashford Energy during those 11 days was not favorable. The second earnings miss in 3 months. An analyst downgrade. A Wall Street Journal piece, short and pointed, about succession challenges in family-owned energy companies that did not mention Ashford by name, but that everyone in the Houston energy community understood completely. On the 12th day, Diane Okafor called Marcus directly and said the board would like to schedule a presentation. I walked into the Ashford Tower boardroom for the second time in my life, wearing a suit that had not been rained on. 63 people had witnessed the ceremony of my displacement. 7 people witnessed what happened next. Myself, Marcus, Diane Okafor, 3 additional board members, and my father, who sat at the head of the long mahogany table and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. I spent the first 10 seconds of the meeting trying to identify it, and then I stopped trying and started presenting instead. Because the presentation was what mattered now, not his expression. I spoke for 90 minutes. I presented Meridian's confirmed asset value, including the Larson development projections. I presented our analysis of Ashford Energy's remaining offshore portfolio using updated modeling that Ashford's own geological team, in its depleted state, had not produced. I presented a restructuring proposal that would, over a 36-month window, restore Ashford's operational performance and significantly increase its total asset value by integrating Meridian's confirmed positions with Ashford's adjacent holdings. And I presented at the end the acquisition proposal, the structure by which Meridian Capital Partners, through a combination of cash, equity, and assumption of certain debt obligations, would acquire controlling interest in Ashford Energy. The number was fair. I had worked very hard to make sure it was fair, because I understood that fairness was not sentimentality in this context. It was strategy. An unfair proposal invites litigation, board resistance, regulatory scrutiny. A fair proposal that is also the best available option for the company's shareholders and its remaining employees is simply correct. And correct proposals, presented with sufficient evidence and sufficient patience, have a way of eventually becoming inevitable. My father sat at the head of the table for the entire 90 minutes without speaking. When I finished, there was a period of questions from the board members, which I answered. Then there was a silence. My father said, "You used your mother's name." It was not the question I had expected. It was not a business question at all. Yes, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. That expression again, the one I had been trying to name since I walked into the room. I finally understood it now. It was not remorse, exactly, though there was something in the neighborhood of remorse present. It was recognition. The specific, arriving recognition of someone who has been looking past something for a very long time and has only just allowed himself to see it clearly. It was the expression of a man understanding, too late, but not without impact, what he had been looking at all along. He did not apologize. My father was not a man who apologized. I had understood this about him for a long time and had made my peace with it in the way you make peace with things that will not change. Not by pretending they don't exist, but by building your life in a way that does not require them to be different than they are. The board voted. The vote was not unanimous. Nothing this significant ever is, but it was sufficient. The acquisition was approved in principle, subject to due diligence and regulatory review, both of which proceeded without material complication over the following 4 months. On the morning the final closing documents were signed, I was in a conference room at Meridian's offices. Our offices now, in the building slightly left of the Ashford Tower, with Marcus and 2 attorneys and a notary and a great deal of paperwork. Dominic was not present. Dominic had resigned 6 weeks prior, negotiating a departure package that was, under the circumstances, generous. I had not contested the package. I understood something about the peculiar position he had occupied, not entirely the architect of his own elevation, not entirely its passive recipient either, and I did not feel the need to extract maximum cost from someone who had ultimately been a secondary actor in a drama that had very little to do with him. My father was also not present. He had signed his portion of the documents the previous day in his attorney's office. I had been told he looked well. I chose to believe this. I signed the last document at 11:47 in the morning, on a day that was sunny for once. The Houston sky doing that particular blue it sometimes achieves in winter that makes you understand why people who were born here cannot quite bring themselves to leave. Marcus slid the folder closed and looked at me across the conference table. "How does it feel?" he asked. I thought about it honestly, which is the only way I know how to think about things that matter. It did not feel like victory. Victory implies a contest, and a contest implies 2 parties who understood they were competing. My father had never understood we were competing. He had simply looked in one direction his entire life and declined to look in mine, and the story of what I had built was ultimately the story of what becomes possible when you stop waiting for someone to look at you and start looking, with full attention and complete honesty, at yourself. "It feels like the end of one thing," I said, "and the beginning of something I haven't named yet." Marcus nodded, the way he always nodded when he found an answer satisfactory, without it being complete. He stood up and held out his hand, and I shook it, and then I walked out of the conference room and down the hallway and into the elevator and out through the lobby doors into the winter sunshine. I stood on the sidewalk. I looked left at the building that now, in the legal and financial sense that the world recognizes as binding, was mine. Every floor, every barrel, every geological survey and offshore lease and pipeline junction and quarterly report and board meeting agenda, every single drop. I thought about my mother's maiden name. I thought about a trailer outside Midland, Texas, and a man named Carl Briggs who had told a 23-year-old he had good eyes. I thought about seismic data and the patience required to look at what you cannot see directly and infer its shape from the patterns of what you can. And then I turned away from the building and walked in the other direction, toward nothing in particular, into a city that was bright and wide and entirely indifferent to my history, which was exactly what I needed it to be. There was, after all, work to do,